I'm very pleased to welcome you on behalf of the Ilias State University. First of all, let me begin by thanking you all for joining us today and for making the previous summer school and today's international workshop possible. It is a great honor for us to host this event. Just a few words about the importance of this conference and of internationalization of Georgian or Caucasian studies in general, which was one of the important missions of the first Georgian university since 1918. Despite the Soviet isolation since 1921, the founders of the university, that is the first generation of Georgian scientists, and their students, that is our teachers, were able, through formal or informal relations, to keep Ქართველოლოგიი and Caucasian studies in international science discussions. Today we will have an opportunity to listen representative of this generation, Professor Mzekala. I remember how this relationship went on in the Soviet time. I remember how Professor Guram Topuri and other Georgian colleagues collected all printed material in the former Soviet Union, annotated and sent them to Professor Karl Schmidt, Professor Winfried Böder, and other Ქართველologists. For the next generations, opportunities for internationalization of science gradually diminished. The post-Soviet time period, the so-called 90s, were not only, how to say, unfavorable for the development of science, but were extremely difficult in general. Despite individual scientists who succeeded in internationalizing of their research project, the post-Soviet Georgian science remained in deep isolation. Despite occasional successes, the slow and controversial process of modernizing of education and research system as a country in general, which started in 2006, has been hardly able to support common space for scientific discussions with Western scholarships, that is to speak here in Georgia the same language with our Western colleagues. So this is a fact, and with an unflattering background. On the other hand, we can be proud of our younger generation, who most of all need a working space for discussions here in Georgia as well as abroad to fill the gaps in their education, so caused by the mentioned decline. On this challenging way of developing a new system, it is crucial for us, for the post-Soviet Georgian scientists, to share international experience and to engage in large-scale joint projects, such as previous summer school in 2017. It was at the Tbilisi State University, and this time at the Ilias State University, and today's conference organized by Professor Maria Polinsky and Lea Nash, for which I would like to express my sincere appreciation. I hope we can collaborate fruitfully to make this initiative a joint working platform for Georgian and foreign scientists. In this regard, I would like to thank the Shota Rustaveli National Science Foundation for supporting this conference, and all the participating universities, University of Maryland, Paris 8, and Ilias State as well, for supporting of summer schools. So just a few words about Georgian or Caucasian studies at the Ilias State University. Of course, it means not only linguistic Ქართველოლოგიი, but also Caucasian biodiversity, Georgian ethnobotany, mineralogy, etc., etc. In terms of internationalization of Georgian in study in general at ISU, I would like to stress here 2 points. We are the only university in Georgia that offers PhD level free of charge, but requires from a PhD candidate to publish a research article in an internationally peer-reviewed journals, and develops joint PhD programs. Last year we started 2 joint programs with the University of Göttingen and University of Münster. Both are supported by the Volkswagen Stiftung and Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft and the Shota Rustaveli National Science Foundation. And we are the only university in Georgia that every year financed research, joint and local research project initiated by the professors of ISU. In case of Institute of Linguistic Studies, I represent, it makes 215,000 lari every year. One of the important direction of my institute is to support, to adopt and promote up-to-date standards and methods of applied linguistics and digital humanities in general, both in research and teaching. So I will only briefly present you the most important project from the field of Ქართველოლოგии. My colleagues, Professor Irina Lobzhanidze and Professor Tamar Makharoblidze, will speak about them separately. This is a Georgian language corpus. At present, it is the biggest annotated corpora for Georgian language, divided into monolingual and bilingual section. The monolingual section consists of New and Modern Georgian corpus and Old and Middle Georgian corpus. This is the biggest part with about 3,200 annotated fiction, non-fiction texts. There is a finite state morphological analyzer and generator of modern and new Georgian integrate into it. At present, the analyzer has been adjusted to the literary work of Old and Middle Georgian. The Old and Middle Georgian corpus consists from the original Georgian works and translations, corpora structured according to the translation schools, and that means the stylistic and chronological principle. It is divided into pre-Attonite, Attonite, Antiochanian, and Galati school corpora on the one hand, and according to the source text, that means Greek Georgian, Christian, Arabic Georgian, Syriac German, and Armenian Georgian on the other hand. The bilingual corpus, so this is the old Georgian text. The bilingual corpus of its parts contains translations from Georgian into foreign languages. So far it consists Georgian English parallel corpus of Webchistrausani with all Georgian survived manuscripts and editions, and with 2 English translations made by Marjorie Wardrop and Venera Urushadze. And the next is the Georgian Chronicles, Old Georgian, Old Armenian text with new Georgian translations also. I can show you maybe the Armenian one. This is an old Georgian text, old Armenian translations from 12th century, end of 12th century, and new Georgian translations made by Ilya Buladze. Now we try to settle the copyright problems of English and translations by Robert Thompson. This part of the project will be soon complete. So the GLC, Georgian language corpus, divided into monolingual corpora with original Georgian literature and the translations from foreign languages into Georgian on the one hand, and bilingual corpora with the translations from Georgian into foreign language. I mean, the rich textual legacy of Georgian language is presented not only from the perspective of historical grammar, new Old, Middle, New, and Modern Georgian, but also from the perspective of relations of Georgian with other cultures and languages. So regarding these relations, it's the next project of our institute, the epigraphic corpus of Georgia, very important. At present, it contains epigraphic inscriptions, Jewish, Greek, Armenian, Aramaic, and Georgian, of course, dating from between 9th century AD. So I wanted to show the next project, and so the group of Kvartolologists working on the Kartvelian languages, including Georgian Sign Language, working at ISU. This is a grammar of Georgian Sign Language, online vocabulary and vocabulary of Georgian Sign Language, and alphabet of Georgian Sign Language. Tamar Makharoblite will speak about them separately, as I mentioned. And the group, since they are working at the ISU since 2006, under the head of Guram Kartozia. This is a grammar of Mingrelian language by Guram Kartozia and Rusudan Gersamia Mayalomia Tayatskhadaya, and morphological glossing of Mingrelian language by Mayalomia and Rusudan Gersamia, phonosemantical lexic of Khართველian language and Mingrelian text, etc. So I will not take up any more of your time. My colleagues, as I mentioned, my colleague will speak about them separately. I wish you a fruitful work at this conference and every success in our joint activities in future. And now I will give the floor to my teacher, Professor Mze Kalashanidze.
Ara. ორიოდეს იტყვა მხოლოდ ქართულად. საქართველოშია კონფერენცია და მინდა მივესალმო და უსურვო წარმატებული მუშაობა. ამ უნივერსიტეტში, ილიას უნივერსიტეტში ბევრი რამ კეთდება, ბევრი ახალი რამ არის და მე იმედი მაქვს, რომ ამ კონფერენციაზე ბევრს ახალს გავიგონებთ და მოვისმენთ. ეხლა თუნებას მომცემთ ვინაიდან ჩვენ სტუმრები გვყავს აქ, მათაც დაველაპარაკები. თუნებას მომცემთ დავჯდები. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, I'm very glad to see you here, and I hope that our joint work will be successful. Nino here has spoken quite at length and outlined the main aims of the conference. But I should like to remind you in a few words of what has led up to the modern level of linguistic knowledge and linguistic work here. Georgia is a country of old literacy, and because of this we had a very large Christian literature, and in the frame of Christian literature we have very many translations of Greek Byzantine works, and since questions of language were important there, we also have an interest in a language. Of course, those who work in linguistics know that in old times linguistics were mainly connected with exegesis. And naturally, the old Georgian works are also of this kind. But it is at the same time, it is important to understand that interest in language is quite clearly defined in Old Georgian. For instance, we have a very interesting grammatical treatise of the 11th century where Georgian language is compared with Greek. Afterwards, unfortunately, the development of scholarship was met with several obstacles. These obstacles are of a political kind. Georgia is situated on the crossroads of the world, and because of this, every kind of invader who existed in medieval times passed through Georgia. This was a great obstacle for all kinds of scholarly work. And up to the 18th century, we do not have any interesting examples of linguistic work, but there are some exceptions. Sulhan Sabah Orbeliani's dictionary is an amazing thing. It remains up to this day a mystery to me personally how he managed to make a dictionary which is well nigh up to the modern standards, and which is even today is indispensable for any linguist who has to do with the Georgian language. The 18th century began to show us some interest, but these were mainly practical manuals to learn Georgian. They are not scholarly investigations. In the 19th century, interest for the Georgian language became manifest with the rise of the new generation, which was interested in proving that Georgian was, as a national language, was important for Georgian self-identification. Yes. There were several works are written in the 19th century, several grammars of the Georgian language, but they are not scientific works. There was no linguistic school in the 19th century. Linguistic research began in the 20th century with the foundation of the Georgian University. And the first dissertation which was held in the university was practically the beginning of scholarly research of the Georgian language, because there was a special question discussed if the old works were merely reviews of the Georgian language written by persons who spoke Georgian and knew Georgian but had no scientific background in their work. At the beginning of the work in the Tbilisi University, real scholarly research began. These were the people who came from the Petersburg University or from other European centers. These were the founder of the university, Ivan Javahishvili, Joseph Kipshidze, Akaki Shanidze, and others. These laid the foundations of Georgian linguistics in the proper sense of the word. I am not speaking here as a daughter of Akaki Shanidze. I am merely speaking as a professional. In the Soviet times, there were also many obstacles to scientific work in general and to the linguistics also. For instance, Marism, so-called, became a great obstacle. But I must say that one thing, that Mar himself was not responsible for this. When Marism flourished and when Marism became an obstacle to real work, because one had to work on the lines that language was something that had to do with the class struggle. Mar himself had nothing to do with this. He was already in his grave. Despite this fact, the people who had good knowledge of the level of the linguistics as it was at the beginning of the 20th century, managed to uphold the level of learning in the university and in the other scientific organizations which flourished also in Georgia, the Institute for Linguistics and so on. It was difficult to work because in those times we had the connections with Europe were practically nil. But despite this fact, the teachers, our teachers who taught us, gave us the traditions. We were able to understand what was happening in the science of linguistics generally in Europe. And I hope that now, when the young people are studying linguistics, I hope that they will uphold this level and they will give us new knowledge of what is happening in linguistics. Because of this, I think that this conference is very important. Many people have come here, people whom we know. There are others also whom we don't know, and I hope that there will be interesting discussions. We will hear new ideas with which we may agree or we may disagree, but in any case, such meetings are very important because we get to know each other and we get to know what is happening in the world. So I wish you success, and I wish and I hope that our work will be successful.
Thank you very much. You see the second generation of Georgian linguists, the Institute of Oriental Studies, Institute of Manuscripts, or Institute of Linguistics, represented by the generation Professor Mze Kalashanidze, Tamas Gamqrelidze, Girima Chavariani, Togo Gudava, Zurab Japaridze, Bakar Gigineishvili, Tedo Turgaidze, Irine Melikishvili, Damana Melikishvili, Bela Kobalava are a good example of this traditional knowledge. Talendidi Madlova Kavatom Sekala მშვენიერი სიტყვისთვის ჩვენ არა გვაქვს გათვალისწინებული ასე ვთქვათ თარგმანი, იმიტომ რომ აქ არ არის სპეციალური აპარატი და იმის დაქირავება გაცილებით უფრო ძვირი ღირს მართალი კითხვა და დადგმა, ვიდრე სამი ქართველოლოგიური კონფერენციის მოწვევა. ამიტომ ყველა ჩვენგანს გვექნება შესაძლებლობა მივესა აი ეს პარალელური თარგმანი, როცა ყოველ წინადადებას აწყვეტინებ და მე მეორე ასე ვთქვათ თარგმნის იმ წინადადებას არის ძალიან დამღლელი, ამიტომ გადავწყვიტეთ რომ ყველამ თავისი მოხსენების მოკლე რეზუმე ან თუნდაც უფრო ვრცელი თქვა ქართულად და ასევე ინგლისურად პოსტერის პრეზენტაციებზე იქნება საშუალება რომ ვთქვათ ვისაც სურს რომ ქართულად გააკეთოს მოხსენება, ჩვენი მაგისტრები, დოქტორანტები, კოლეგები აქვე იქნებიან და არის შესაძლებლობა რომ ითარგმნოს ეს და ეხლა მინდა ვთხოვო ქავტონ რუსუდან ასათიანს როგორც აი იმ ტრადიციული გზის გაგრძელებას სიტყვა. Gives for to Rusudan.
Thank you, Madlov. მე ვფიქრე მარიასთვის ხომ არ მიგვეცა ჯერ სიტყვა და მე არ ვიცი, კარგით იყოს ახან ასე. First of all, of course, უპირველეს ყოვლისა ყველას მოგესალმებით. ძალიან მიხარია რომ ისევ ერთად ვარ. I would like to express my pleasure that you all are here. Some faces are already very famous for us, very close for us, very close for us. Thank you that you are again here. But I'm also very happy that we have new faces as well, especially students. And I want to, of course, I want to express my hope that such kind of events will continue and the relations became more tense and more productive, maybe, especially for our young generation. This is really very important. So, მინდოდა ქალბატონზე ქალის შემდეგ ოდნავ არავშოს ეხლა ვაკე ჩამოვშლით. Sorry. ნინოს გამოსვლის შემდეგ ძნელია რაღაც ისეთი დავამატო ალბათ, მაგრამ I just mentioned that after no. People. I found. Thank you. Thank you. So I don't know now what to add. Because if we speak about the works in Georgia, we have to have a really very long talk, because a lot of new works appeared. But if we speak about the most important works, then this is really very dangerous in Georgia, because everybody thinks that his work is the best, and if I forgot even one, then I could disappear in this space at least. Okay, so I decided just make some reclam talk and give some arguments why can the Kvartalian linguistics be interesting to scientists from all over the world. Okay, I know that Georgia is somehow interesting for foreigners. A lot of tourists are here now in Georgia. Nature, food, maybe people as well. This is very exotic for foreigners and very surprising. I know that a lot of foreigners say that Georgian life made give them the life experience. It's not my words, this is our guests. So I know that this is okay, but I think that for scientists, Kvartalian linguistics is also must be very interesting and exotic somehow. And what's the main grounds for this? Why I say this? Okay, this is brief history of Ქართველოლოგии. I don't want to repeat. Our teacher, Mr. Kalashanidze, said a lot about this. But ancient period could be said that it begins by the works Ioane Petridze and Ephraim Tsire, and of course Anton Katalikos, who had in his works very interesting general linguistic issues. He investigated and even have some concept of phoneme as he defines his main in his work, main entity of the language. But of course, this is past, and absolutely agree with the Kalashanidze that there was no systematic scientific works, and Georgian grammatical tradition begins with the names which are famous, I think, for every Georgian and foreigners also who are trying to study Georgian. They all know Georgi Akhulediani, phonology and phonetics of Georgia mostly. Akakishanidze still we use in schools his books, or in scientific, from a scientific point of view, his Georgian grammar is not only manual, it's investigation. This is a really very interesting research of Georgian language system. Of course, time is going, everything is changing, new methodology rises, maybe somebody agrees with his interpretation, maybe not, but this is definitely the basis which is important for everybody who is interested in Khatwalian, especially Georgian language system. And of course I have to say something about Chikobava as well. It does not matter how yes, it does not matter whether his methodology was successful or not. I would say so. His methodology was somehow more subjective, maybe, sorry, I'm not sociolinguist, but maybe somehow politically motivated. But still, he was a lot of things and developed Georgian grammatical tradition, of course, as well. Okay, the issues of Caucasian languages are more problematic. The works where he describes even Georgian or
before one has any ideas, theoretical ideas concerning a language, one has to know the facts. And the facts of Georgian, Kartvelian and Caucasian languages were practically unknown. And before one builds theories, one has to know this. And very much was done in those times. Facts about Georgian language and Caucasian language, scientific facts, became known only in the 20th century. That's what's important.
Absolutely, I agree. Absolutely, I agree, but I just want to mention that if somebody is studying Ქართველოლოგიი, these names definitely appeared in his experience. And everybody must know that methodology is really very important, of course. And if Akakishanidze's work is like very good structuralist analysis of Georgian language, I don't want to make analysis of Chikobava. It's more subjective, it's more okay, we'll do. Okay, so as I don't want to speak about difficulties which arise after Georgian independence, because now the situation becomes step by step better, and this event, and especially the school which finished the day before, is the one argument that the last point, international collaboration, which was really, really very poor and difficult, now becomes better and better. And this is really very good, because if we really want to do all works in Khatvoilology, then we must know that all attempts must be undertaken on the basis of new theoretical approaches and achievements. Everything which was done it's okay, but new methodology opens new possibilities. So we need to be trained in new methodologies and return to the main issues of Kvartalian languages and the Georgian as well, to make the things more clear. This is absolutely clear for me, and that's why we try to develop such kind of events as we have today and as we had the summer school. For example, our institute at Ivani State University also is co-organizer of the international event Language Logic Competition, where we met Leah, not first time, but the real time, I could say so. And what was the reason? Just only think, the gap which was raised after 20 years of disappearing education as science, to fill all gaps, to give the students new methodology, to give the students the device which help them to continue the work, to continue Kvartologist issues elaboration and so on. So, and this is very, very interesting LLC conferences, because it began at 1995. It was really very difficult time, even without light, without any kind of food. Georgians know this. And it was really very difficult, but if in any, it's biannual, in any 2 years we have, and the next year will be the 15th already. So this is for students, because during conferences we have tutorials as well. And then we have also summer school in language and logic, and Matthias Bass helps us to organize this. And this is really also very important, because formal semantics help to develop computational linguistic, language modeling, and these new very, very, very popular disciplines, yeah? And as a result of these events, we have some students who will continue their education abroad. Some of them return, but unfortunately not many of them. But they continue their works abroad, and contacts, of course, help us to develop our students' level as well. Okay, and and I'm also really very glad that new event added to this kind of activities. This summer school in GGR, which is already the second one, and the conference, which is also the second one, but first in Georgia. And thank you everybody who took the part and takes the part in this event. And please don't think that our students are not interested in. You see, they are quite smart, but they are too busy. I mean, what I mean, they have to work. So this is always very difficult. During the day they have work, and during the evening all our lectures at magistrat, how to say, okay, we began this lecture at 6, at 7 after their work, and so sometimes this is difficult for them to find the time, but I'm absolutely sure that their interest will give us a productive future, let's say so. Okay, here you already saw the main directions, traditional and new ones, And all of them are really very important. I just want to mention that comparative studies among young generation is not so popular now. And of course, computational linguistics became in the first place. But I also like that some issues of psychological linguistics or sociolinguistics are actualized in their works as well. But of course, analysis studies of Kartvelian languages is continuing, and I hope it will be continuing as well. So I think it's time to answer to the main question, which was like a reclam of Kvartholology. Why the scientists from all over the world can be interested in Kvartholology? Why? First of all, despite we cannot say that Georgian is not well studied, still there are some gaps and issues that need further elaboration. So there is objects which need to be analyzed and to be became more understandable from the perspective of the general linguistics or typological linguistics. So what is made in Kvartholology, it's somehow not understandable for foreigners. Even terminology, Georgian terminology, makes them confusing, and that's this is the main argument. So there is, of course, something which needs to be analyzed. I think linguistics could never stop. Even English needs to be analyzed more and more. Yeah, that's usual thing. But what's specific that Georgian texts are coming from the 5th century. So Georgian gives absolutely, I don't say unique, but very seldom opportunity to study 1,000 years history of a language system. It's not so usual. Then you have documents and you can see how language changed all over the centuries. And okay, this is good, but the Kvartelian language systems are somehow exotic if we compare them with Indo-European languages or even with Semitic languages. It has absolutely different structure, even negativity, it's negativity. Georgian, Caucasian languages, they are really very exotic for Europeans because even in, at the end of 19th century, when Uslar began to analyze Caucasian ergative constructions, he gave interpretation that these constructions are passive ones, and this is quite understandable because object is a nominative, and according most Indo-European languages, it looks like passive constructions. And even the term ergativity is very young. I tried to, me and Zura, we tried to find where it first appeared, and it was just 1929, 2030. So, and the Georgian language system is very interesting from this point of view because it gives very peculiar representations of, let's say so, linguistic representations of reality. And that's why Georgian and Kartvelian languages could be the testing ones for the new linguistic theories verification. Because when theory is built on the base of one kind, one type of language, it could be tested. Does it work for other language systems or not? And Georgian is the best example for this. And of course, because of the specificity of Kartvelian languages, they couldn't reach the main issues of general linguistics. Elisa, do you agree with me? So these 5 points, they come together and open new perspectives for young scientists, not only in Georgia, and abroad as well. I hope that Ქართველოლოგია still has potential to be developed and to be enriched and to give its results. Okay. So that's here is again future vista that Kartvelian studies could make a contribution in cross-linguistic studies. Of course, any language is very important from this point of view. Typological investigations, language universals, and general and theoretical linguistics. This is clear. And what is also very important, that cooperation can successfully develop in both directions. So new theories could help us to analyze Kartvelian data more adequately, let's say so. And Kartvelian data itself helps to develop and correct somehow new theories. So this balance is really also interesting, could be interesting for young generation, I think. And now here are some bibliography of last works, and I would thank Wimpy Bede, who makes this work very carefully, and thank you from Georgian Linguistic Society that he gathers so accurately all, even a paper, new paper, which is published in Georgia. And his bibliography now is most exhaustive, let's say so. So again, foreigners are much more, how to say, much more Sakmian than Georgians, because Georgians like to do everything, don't think about documentation, about presentations, about make something as written, as documented, which is not, I think, traditional feature of Georgians, because as Nino said, a lot of manuscripts, a lot of translations, a lot of all the texts show that not only oral knowledge, but also documented in works, manuscripts, knowledge was usual for Georgian. Is it okay? Oh, I have a lot of, but just only one comment which I want to say, that it's really very important to realize that when I was included in international projects, of course, some issue, I gave them some descriptions, some interpretations, and so on. And as soon as they think about publication, they ask me, please give bibliography where it's said, where it's given. And I was absolutely shocked because I could not find this knowledge printed in the material. It was not were not my ideas. It was my knowledge, which came from my teachers, from tradition. I don't know. It's absolutely clear that this knowledge was in Ქართველოლოგიისა, like very famous one, but I could not find any article where it was fixed, let's say so. This is one problem, new problem of not young, but second generation or the third generation or the first generation, I always say to my students, don't think about really very big or very, very, very important. This is okay, but very effective things. Do everything very honestly, very carefully, and please print even a small article, because all knowledge must be somehow documented. Sorry. And again, I would like to return to our conference and say again thank you to our guest, because you are here, you help us to be more active. Very interesting that even not only foreigners are, this event help us to see not only our foreign colleagues, but sometimes Georgian colleagues as well, because life here is so tense that I saw some my Georgian colleagues in such kind of events, and we have no other possibilities to meet each other. So thank you again, and I hope that these kind of events will develop, will be helpful not only for Georgian students and Georgian society and scientists, but for foreign students and foreign society as well. Thank you, and big success. And of course, we would like to ask one of the organizers, Maria, to say some words. Just or we have a time until coffee break. So
thank you very much for having us here. It's really an honor. And I can speak for Leigh and for myself. This is a dream come true, because when we first had the workshop in Paris, we didn't know it was going to continue. And so we're very happy that we're back together, and we're back in Tbilisi, in Georgia. So when I first came to Tbilisi many years ago, I learned the word tergdaliuli. And it's an old word. Means, those of you who don't know, it means the people who crossed the Terek River to drink from it and go up. So I think that tergdaliuli has changed, because now we are tergdaliuli. We come back here and we drink from the Terek, crossing it, because we want to learn about the Georgian language, about Kartvelian, and we want to form teams, because language has always been at the core of a lot of human endeavor, and always been at the core of many different fields of study. And in the 21st century, language has become this really important hub which brings together all kinds of things, from very theoretical deliberations about the structure to experimental work to work on sociolinguistics. And one of the goals of these gatherings is to make sure that people who are interested in different things, from running computer programs to thinking about phrase structure in Georgian, can talk to each other. And that's how we set it up. In Paris and here, there will be a number of tutorials. The goal is that people could actually talk to each other and come up with joint projects. So several people today talked about how this is not just talking about the rich past of the Georgian language, but also looking into the future. And that's how we see those workshops. So it's my hope that there will be more tergdaliuli, that there will be more young people here who want to go both ways and work together, and the boundaries do not matter so much. So thank you very much for organizing everything. Thanks for your wonderful remarks. and hopefully we'll have 2.5 days of a lot of interesting discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Leah. No? Okay. As you like, you are with us anyway. So, and now then we can... dinner or coffee break? But here was coffee break. Oh, okay, okay. Very great. So it's lunchtime. Please join everybody this time. And after the lunch, I would really very happy to ask Elisa to give her talk. You know that Elisa was her first visit was when you were a student. I was also a very young student, and I remember this absolutely beautiful girl with blue eyes, long hair, and with the magic name Alisa. And it was a really difficult time, and it was really like Alisa was in Wonderland with all these adventures. I hope not so dangerous. And I'm so glad that she keeps this interest, because not all people do this. For example, Diane with Hollis, who was with you now, I don't know. Of course, life changes the situations, but I'm really very happy to listen to Elisa and hear keynote talk. Okay, everybody, after lunch, it was at 1 o'clock. So, thank you everybody.
თქვენ შეამჩნევდით ალბათ განსაკუთრებით ეს ეხება ქართველ მონაწილეებს, რომ ჩვენ აქ არა გვაქვს სესიები. ეს არის სამუშაო შეხვედრა ტუტორიალებით განსაკუთრებით და ქართველური ფონოლოგიიდან დაწყებული სემანტიკის ჩათვლით ყავს უცხოელი სტუმრები, რომლებიც ბევრი იშრომეს. მართლა ჩვენთვის არის ეს ძალიან მნიშვნელოვანი, ჩვენი სტუდენტებისთვის საზაფხულო სკოლაში მათ ნახეს და ძალიან გთხოვთ, რომ აი ტუტორიალებზე განსაკუთრებით, იმიტომ რომ ამ კონფერენციის არსი ეს არის არა 200 კაცი, არამედ ტუტორიალები, სადაც ჩვენ მოვახერხებთ, მოусმინოთ ჩვენს უცხოელ კოლეგებს და მოვახერხებთ, რომ ვისაუბროთ ერთ ენაზე. ხო, ანუ to be on the same page, როგორც იტყვიან ინგლისურად. ძალიან დიდი მადლობა. ეხლა ცირე სადილი გვექნება, მსუბუქი სადილი და შემდეგ გავაგრძელებთ ორი მომხსენებელი გვაქვს. Thank you.
Hello. Hi. I have to announce that our sessions today, meetings, is continuing, and the talk is keynote speaker, our Alicia Harris. You can see the name of her talk. I already said something about Alicia, how beautiful and absolutely excellent she was, but I want to add, she is excellent and beautiful, and what's more important, she's absolutely great Ქართველologist, and her works in syntax, her works in Georgian morphology, and I think any issues. I just remember your excellent article about cleft contractions, syntax, and so on. So she is our a very important guest, and please enjoy yourself with her talk.
დიდი მადლობა რომ დამპატიჟეთ. არა, ეს მირჩევნია თუ გესმით? კი, მაგრამ ჩემთან Thank you for inviting me here. I'm very honored by the invitation. So I want to talk about something called the suffixing preference, which I'll explain in just a minute. I want to emphasize that this is joint work. This is work in psycholinguistics. And if you know me, you know that I'm not a psycholinguist. I'm not trained in psycholinguistics. So I have collaborated with a psycholinguist, Arthur Samuel. So I'm reporting on joint work, even though I'm the one who wrote this, and any errors should be attributed to me. So what is the suffixing preference? This goes back to an observation made by Joseph Greenberg as far back as 1963, before most of you were born. Greenberg noticed that there are more languages in the world that use only suffixes than there are languages that use only prefixes. And among languages that use both, like Georgian and English, there are more suffixes. So that's what is known as the suffixing preference in typology. The big question is, why does it exist? And in 1988, Jack Hawkins and Ann Cutler wrote actually a couple of articles explaining this preference. They showed in part that spoken word recognition relies most heavily on the beginnings of words, making it advantageous to have no prefix. So they showed that speakers pay particular attention to the beginning of the word, secondarily to the end of the word, and the part that doesn't get much attention at all is the middle of the word. So you, according to them, you don't want to put the most important part, the lexical part, in the middle of the word. So this would explain the suffixing preference, or a good part of it, and they explained more, which I won't go into. So the hypothesis that they stated has not been, well, what I've written here has not been thoroughly tested on non-Indo-European languages. Actually, it's hardly been tested at all. It hasn't really been tested on English, as far as I'm aware, or on other languages. But it ought to be tested on non-Indo-European languages, because what they based their statement on was entirely based on Indo-European languages. So in order to understand how complex words are processed, that is, how speakers understand a complex word, we need to understand better how they process or how they understand affixes. In other words, can you understand a prefix better than a suffix? Can you understand a suffix better than a prefix? Or are they equal? So our goal in our research and in this, well, I wrote article in this presentation, is to expand the set of languages in which the processing and production of prefixes and suffixes has been compared. So here's what I'm planning to do in this talk. I'm going to talk a little bit about the literature that, that has gone before, but not very much, because there isn't very much. I'm going to talk about problems with previous research, because we want to avoid those problems. I'm going to describe the present study in general, and then I'm going to walk us through, well, 3 experiments, if there's time for that many. Otherwise, I'll skip the 3rd. And then I'll come to a summary. Excuse me. So Hawkins and Cutler cite work that shows that the beginnings of words are psychologically most salient. Those are their terms. And the ends of words less so, and the middles are least salient. This is what I've already said. They base their work in part on the work that I have written here. There's more, but these are among them. So Nottebohm I don't know how to pronounce his name. And I've written Dutch there. I don't mean that he's Dutch, I believe he is, but Dutch is the language he was working on. And he showed that the beginning of a word is more effective in cueing the retrieval of a word. In other words, if you know what the beginning is, you can better think of a word than is the end. Berza and Zwan, also working on Dutch, and Horowitz, Chilean, pardon my pronunciation of all these names, I don't know how to pronounce them, and Dunnigan, working on English, showed that the beginnings of words trigger better recall from a list. And then Brown and McNeil, working on English, found that participants in a tip of the tongue state, that refers to when you want to think of a word and it's right on the tip of your tongue, but you can't quite think of it. Those people, that happens to all of us, they could state most often the initial consonant, or more generally the beginning of a word, the number of syllables, the position of stress, and the end of the word, but even though they couldn't think of the whole word. So that's the research that went before. One of the problems is that these sources investigated words like native or simple, or the Dutch word, cannibal. So words that don't have prefixes per se. A few of the words had suffixes, like this is from one of the articles, fibber and pugnacity, but that seemed to be an accident. They weren't setting out to do that. In other words, in most of the studies that Hawkins and Cutler cited, the presence of prefixes and suffixes was not controlled for. That is, they didn't carefully have lists with prefixes and lists with suffixes. So that's one of the things we want to do. And furthermore, it's an extrapolation to assume that prefixes, for example, share the characteristics that were listed above for the beginnings of words. They listed characteristics of the beginnings of words, but is that true of a prefix? Well, we don't really know. It's an extrapolation to think that it is. It hasn't really been studied. Further, the importance of the beginning of the words in lexical access may depend on peculiarities of English, since English was the main language that they based their research on. Most Germanic languages have strong initial syllables, and most of the articles that Hawkins and Cutler cited were based on English with a few other languages. Dutch, I've said, also perhaps French, Spanish, Italian, but not lots of languages. Another issue is transferability. So early work in psycholinguistics assumed that processing, understanding language, principles of processing were universal. Processing methods used in English could reasonably be assumed to be used in other languages. But Cutler, in work, notice that this work actually preceded the work she did with Hawkins. Some of it preceded it, 1985, as compared with 1988 when she did the work with Hawkins. And then she has returned to this issue in 2009. Cutler shows that processing is not always the same in languages, and many other researchers have confirmed this with various areas of language, all the way from prosody to semantics. There has been a lot of psycholinguistic work done on morphology, but little on this issue, as I mentioned. So some of the lines of research have been, are words accessed as wholes or broken down into constituent parts? A very interesting issue, but not really relevant to this, or not very relevant. And do related words, that is, words sharing at least one morpheme, influence each other in priming experiments? So there's been a lot of, we know a lot more about morphology, about processing of morphology, but not very much about this typological issue about prefixes and suffixes. One of the interesting things that has come out of the work on morphology is that lexical decision time, so for example, deciding whether something is a word of your language, how long that takes, the decision time. Lexical decision times are influenced by both base frequency, that is the frequency of the lexical base, the lexical part of a word, and surface frequency, that's the frequency of the actual word, like the difference between the frequency of see, the verbs to see, and the form sees. So both of those frequencies are relevant. And we have taken that into account. I'm not going to report on frequencies today. I want to look now at problems that previous research on psycholinguistic morphology has shown. English only. English is not really a good language to study morphology in, and yet it's the language that has been most studied. English has very simple inflectional morphology, and the overall complexity of words is low compared with that of many other languages. English has no inflectional prefixes and only a few inflectional suffixes. Most affixes in English consist of at least one syllable. There are some exceptions. English has a huge number of borrowed Latinate words, and that means that the vocabulary splits into two parts with different characteristics. And lastly, the orthography of English was designed for another language, and the spelling of words no longer correlates very highly with the pronunciation. So that's relevant if you're if you're reading things in your experiments. We want to avoid these problems. Most of the work has been on written language. The dynamics of spoken words, serial presentation in time. I can't say two words at one time, and neither can you. Spoken language is natural and acquired by essentially all children, whereas reading is a skill that must be taught with years of training. A third problem with working on written language is that there's enormous variation across languages in the level of transparency of the spelling, basically. And then finally, cross-modal studies, that is, studies using both oral input and written scene input are believed by some psycholinguists to tap into something more basic than either oral or written alone. We want to take advantage of that last observation, and we want to avoid the problems of written language alone. And then I want to just mention three reasons for a difference between prefixes and suffixes in priming experiments. These are quotations, the first three, from one paper. And I don't mean to pick on this paper, but as I read it, I thought, well, then why did you work on French? This is a paper based on work on French. So they wrote, prefixes have a more predominantly compositional character than suffixes. Okay, in French maybe, but that's not a universal. Prefixes have an exclusively semantic function, whereas derivational suffixes have both semantic and syntactic functions. Sorry, I stressed the wrong word there. Derivational suffixes, I should have said. So a difference between prefixes and suffixes. To me, it seems that they didn't choose their language or their materials very well. Third, prefixes never phonologically or orthographically transform the base to which they attach, whereas suffixes do. Again, a characteristic of the language and of written work. And then from other papers, I would add, among experimental items in other papers, so-called prefixed test items also contained suffixes, so they weren't very well controlled. This is this is from the same paper. This is not a quotation, but my observation, that when they listed their prefixed items, yeah, they all had prefixes, but some of them had suffixes and some of them didn't. So I thought they weren't very well controlled. So to avoid the problems I've talked about, we designed our study differently. First of all, we haven't assumed transferability. So we're not assuming that that Hawkins and Cutler's observation is correct. We want to see whether it's correct. We have selected completely objectively an appropriate language lacking the characteristics of the previous slide. Now you're going to say, oh no, Alice, you've been working on Georgian all your life. What language would you turn to? I assure you that is not the reason. It's entirely objective because Georgian has exactly the characteristics we wanted. Actually, it does. And so I'm in part joking, but in part, I mean, it really is true. And we've strictly controlled for prefixes and suffixes, meaning that when we test something with a prefix, I assure you there are no suffixes there. Wait, I'll modify that in just a minute. And when we test for suffixes, there are no prefixes there. There are exceptions. We have some exceptions where there's both a prefix and a suffix plus the prefix or suffix we're looking at. We had to do that. I'll tell you more about that in a minute. So we've selected a language, just coincidentally, Georgian, that lacks strong initial syllables of the Germanic type. And we have used spoken language in some experiments and cross-modal prompts in others, that is both spoken and written prompts in other languages. So what are these characteristics that are so wonderful for our experiments? Georgian isn't in Indo-European, wonderful. It has complex inflectional morphology and the overall complexity of words is high, so that's just what we need. Georgian has inflectional prefixes and suffixes, just what we need, as well as derivational suffixes and circumfixes. Notice that I left out prefixes there, derivational prefixes. There are some, but they're problematic. Georgian has affixes that consist of a syllable or more. I'm not going to read through all of these. By the way, I apologize, especially to Georgians in the audience, for putting Georgian sounds and even words in Latin print. I did it because I knew all the audience would understand that. In this case, maybe I would have had room, but on many of the slides, I simply didn't have room for both. And so I decided on the Latin, and I apologize. While Georgian has borrowed words, it doesn't have a fundamental split in its vocabulary the way English does, and the orthography of Georgian was designed for Georgian, and there's a perfect, well, maybe with the exception of there's a one-to-one correspondence with what you write and what you get. I don't mean that there's no variation, but pretty much so. So what affixes did we study? We studied two pairs, no, actually two groups, I have to say. The first one is a pair. So we studied the inflection. We wanted to study both inflection and derivation. And preferably, we wanted to work with both the verb and the noun. So we chose the inflectional prefix the first person subject marker, and the inflectional suffix se, one of the third person singular subject markers. So if you don't know Georgian, there's a difference in the way I put it because se is only used with the singular, whereas ve is used with both the singular and the plural, but it takes an additional marker if it's plural. So here's a little paradigm with the two forms that we used in bold. So again, controlling very carefully that in the first example, I write, we have only a prefix, and in the second one that we used, tsers, we have only a suffix. The other set that we used, because there's no derivational, so no productive derivational prefix in nouns, we decided to use a circumfix with a prefixal portion and a suffixal portion. So we used the circumfix sa, o, and the circumfix me, e, and we used derivational, derivational suffix complex, oba, eba, and a few others, a small number of them. Notice there that when you compare sao, one of the circumfixes, with oba, one of the suffix complexes, you've got the same number of morphemes, sa and o, and oba, ob and a, and you've got the same number of vowels and consonants, namely 2 vowels and 1 consonant in each set. So, for example, we used me putkre, beekeeper, and putkroba, industriousness, busyness, and sagmiro, heroic, and gmiroba, heroism, or putkre. That's not a word. The star means that it's not a, the asterisk star before it means it's not a word. Those don't exist. Sagmiri doesn't exist, not a word. Gmiro, well, maybe as evocative, but not as part of heroism. That heroism is not based on that. So these are not words. But on the other hand, it makes no difference whether these are actually circumfixes. I'm going to call them circumfixes. If you disagree with me, that's fine. It makes no difference whether they're circumfixes from my point of view. They have to occur together, and they have a joint meaning. That's really all I care about. So I want to just remind you what Hawkins and Cutler's claim is, because it becomes a little bit difficult to interpret some of the results. You need to keep this in mind as we go along. What they claimed was that that spoken word recognition relies most heavily on the beginnings of words, making it advantageous to have no prefix. Spoken, so we're going to use spoken word recognition, we're going to use recognition, and it relies most heavily on the beginnings of words. So we've got words that have prefixes and words that don't have prefixes and do have suffixes. So the first experiment is lexical decision. Lexical decision, I'm skipping to the second one, is a standard task widely used as a measure of accuracy and speed of word recognition. Now I'm going back to the first. The task for the participants was to decide whether an item is a real word of Georgian or a nonce word. I'm going to use the word nonce word. It means a pseudo word, a made-up word, something that's not really a word. I'll give you an example in a minute. I think I've got one in here. And then in the present study, the goal of this experiment was to determine whether participants recognize words with one kind of affix more easily than words with the other kind of affix, comparing the two kinds of verbs, prefixed and suffixed, and comparing the two kinds of nouns, circumfixed and suffixed. So the materials for the first experiment were 24 simplex verbs. By simplex, I mean monomorphemic, with the exception of the morphemes that we're studying. So a word like tser, right, or ban, that can take a prefix and a suffix for inflection. But that's what I mean by simplex verb. Then we also had 24 simplex nonce verbs. So words like bchen, I should have put an asterisk there, that's not a word. Bchen is not a word, and prens is not a word. But we used made-up words like that. So the task was to distinguish which was which. The task for the participants was to distinguish which was which. The materials also included 24 nouns derived with circumfixes, such as me putkre, 24 nouns derived with suffixes, such as putkroba, 48 parallel nonce nouns, such as mechune, again, not a word, pandrola. you may notice that I worked hard to make the participants listen all the way to the end before they knew whether it was a word. So pandrola starts like panjara, which is a word, but the participant isn't going to know till the very end, so they have to pay attention until the end of the word. That was very much on purpose. And then we had 96 distractors, which were actually for a different test words for a different experiment, which we haven't gotten to at all yet. So there were a total of 288 experimental items, and they were randomized differently for each participant. The method, we had 56 participants, 12 of them male. They used a laptop computer, this very one, and headphones, which I had a lot of trouble with. They pressed one key for yes and one key for no. So yes, this is a real word of Georgian. No, this is not a real word of Georgian. Their answers were recorded on the computer, and each participant received instruction and completed a short practice session, and each was paid. So here are the results. Now, I want you to remember what we're testing. We're testing the hypothesis that the beginnings of words, oh gosh, I can't even remember, that the spoken word recognition relies most heavily on the beginnings of words. So these are also the most reliable results that we'll see. We're going to see a lot of results, but this set on this slide are the most reliable ones in the sense that they're the most straightforward. These are lexical decision, which is a very well understood kind of experiment. The next one we're going to do is a little less often used, and so it's less well understood by psycholinguists in general. These are the this slide represents the answers for the words that were real words. We understand better what a person is doing when they say, yes, this is a real word of my language, than we do when they say, no, this is not a real word of my language. So you can see that in the left-hand panel, you've got the error rate. And in the right-hand panel, you've got the reaction time. So the left-hand panel shows that speakers made fewer errors with prefixed words. That's exactly the opposite of what Hawkins and Cutler's hypothesis predicts. And they said it as a cross-linguistic, I mean, they implied that it was a universal. The right-hand slide, as I said, shows the reaction time. That is how long it took the participant to press the button. How long did it take? It took a shorter time for the prefix. So again, that's contrary to what Hawkins and Cutler's hypothesis would predict. So it looks at this point like Georgian verbs, or sorry, these two affixes don't do what Hawkins and Cutler's proposal suggested. Now, everything else is going to be harder to interpret. So this is the same experiment, the same items, but regarding the nonce words. So what did they say for the things that were not real words of Georgian? Well, we can't tell anything from the left-hand panel because they're virtually the same. So we'll just give up on that one. But reaction time we can see. One way of looking at this, the participants must reject nonce words. And one way of looking at this is that prefixed words were harder to reject. Prefixed words were more word-like. Now, how does this relate to Hawkins and Cutler's claim? It's not very clear how it relates. It's somewhat problematic. But that's one way to think about it, that prefixed words were more word-like than suffixed words in this test. Let's go on now to nouns. So we're looking at the left-hand panel compares error rates. The right-hand panel compares reaction times. The left-hand bar in the left-hand in both panels is the bar for circumfixes, and the right-hand bar is the bar for suffixes. We think that the response time here, so I'm talking now about the right-hand panel, we think that the response time, which is not what we would expect, may be because circumfixed words take longer to pronounce. I'm sorry, I meant on the very first slide to emphasize that this is all preliminary. I know I have that in my title, but I meant to remind you that it's all preliminary. We're still analyzing our results. We haven't even gotten to the last two experiments yet. We're working on these three. We think that this may be because circumfixed words take longer to pronounce. We've taken the first step on that and gotten the times, and indeed circumfixed words do take, in our set of items, circumfixed words did take longer on average to pronounce, but it wasn't huge. It wasn't a huge difference, and it is a significant difference between the circumfixed words and the suffixed words, but we don't know yet whether that is an explanation for these results. Otherwise, we don't have an explanation for why the reaction time for nouns was as it is. Now, circumfixes are not prefixes, and this could be due to something else. For example, it could be due to the fact that the circumfix is spread around. So it's in two places, whereas the suffixes, there are two of them, but they're in essentially the same place. So we don't know yet. Not much work in psycholinguistics has been done with circumfixes, so I don't think we're going to find an answer for that somewhere else. So this seems to be, especially the left-hand panel. I guess I didn't talk about the left-hand panel. So the accuracy, the error rate of the left-hand panel is exactly what we would expect if circumfixes are acting like prefixes. We don't know whether they are, but if they are, and it's consistent with what we find on this left-hand panel. The prefix accuracy is higher. The error rate is lower than that of the suffixes. So these are consistent with that. So that I can do at least the second experiment, I propose that I skip this slide because, well, maybe I shouldn't skip it. The circumfixed nonce nouns, so these are the nouns that are not real nouns, they were perceived as more word-like than the suffixed ones. Again, this may be that the effect is due to the circumfix being spread around. We don't know what it's due to. The circumfixed items were rejected less often than the suffixed items were. So I want to make an interim summary before I go on to the second experiment. The results with real words are easier to interpret because we understand better what a participant is doing when they say this is a real word than we do when the participant says this is not a real word. Prefixed real verbs and circumfixed real nouns had lower error rates than suffixed verbs and nouns. Prefixed verbs had faster response times, and the response time of suffixed nouns needs to be studied further. Well, I wrote that before we had, well, it does need to be studied further, but we have measured it, and we did find that circumfix nouns took longer to say. That is, our speaker took longer to say them for whatever reason. But we still have to interpret the results of that. And then finally, prefixed nonce verbs and circumfixed nonce nouns were more word-like, taking longer to reject. Prefixed nonce nouns also had more errors in rejection. So I'm going to go on to experiment 2, verification of real verbs. Our third experiment, which I won't talk about, is verification of nonce verbs, which was a very abstract task, but our participants were up to it. They did great. So verification, in verification, the task for participants is to say whether or not 3 parts belong together. And here are the 3 parts. An inflected form of a real verb, the citation form of a real verb, and a real pronoun. The goal was to determine whether the participants recognize words with one kind of affix more easily than words with the other. So the goal is the same as with the preceding experiment. Here are the materials. So the participant hears vcel, vcels, or vcem. Those are just examples, of course. But they're not going to hear all 3 at one time. So let's take the first example. The participant hears vcel, and he or she sees what you see here, which is written in Georgian, zela, the citation form of the verb that I just used, and me, the first person singular pronoun. So those 3 things match. Vcel, the spoken form. Luckily, I didn't say them. Luckily, we had a native speaker of Georgian say them. So the sound in the ear that they heard in their earphones, vcel, and zela, what you see on the screen, and me, all match. Okay, so in that case, the participant should have pressed yes. On the other hand, if they hear zels, and they see these 2 on the screen, they should have pressed no, because the s suffix doesn't match the pronoun that you see at the bottom, me. Sorry, I'm trying to talk to people who are native speakers of Georgian at the same time I try to talk to people who don't know Georgian, so I'm getting a little bit mixed up here. So the participant should have pressed the no key for that. And then the last example, vcem, is similar. They should press no because the 2 verbs don't match. The 2 stems don't match. One is sem and the other is zel. They don't match, but the pronouns match. So the participants encountered all 3 kinds of examples. They encountered matching terms, half of them matched, and the other half didn't match, and there were 2 kinds of mismatches. That's the point. The materials were 20 simplex verbs. I'm using the same way. And this time we used 20 complex verbs. And by complex, I don't mean very complex. Not like Georgian can be complex. All of them were, no, most of them were had prefixes and eb suffixes, and then whichever inflectional affix we were working with. A few had I and eb. Maybe there were a few obs or other vowel consonant suffixes, but each one had only a vowel prefix and a vowel consonant suffix, plus the affix we were focusing on. And then they had each participant heard each verb both in the first person and the third person, but they were randomized, so they didn't hear them next to each other. And then there were fillers in other person number combinations. I've written persons, but it's person number combinations. So here's an example of a complex verb. So the participant hears, for example, vatschob, or atzkobs, or aduchebs. And they see what you see in front of you, which is atzkoba and is. So the correct answer here is the middle one. So I'll start with that one. If the participant hears atzkobs and sees what you see in front of you, they should press the yes key. If they heard vatskob and see what you see, they should press no. And if they hear aduchebs, they should press no. Now, of course, all of them know the answers. The issue is, can they, well, what we're interested in is, can they recognize either the prefixal forms or the suffixal forms faster than the other? What they probably thought the point was to get the correct answer, and they were being pushed for time because they knew that if they didn't answer, another one would come up automatically eventually. So I should have said that that happened with the first experiment also. So the method, we had the same participants, we used the same computer and headphones. The inflected form was heard through the headphones, and the citation form and pronoun were seen on the screen, as I've already said. So this was a cross-medium experiment. Each participant received instruction and completed a short practice session, and participants were divided into two groups, A and B, so that while one heard a given inflected form and saw the matching citation form and pronoun, the other group heard the same form and saw mismatching citation form and pronoun. And the results. This is the results from the yes responses. Again, we understand the yes responses better than the no responses because we better understand what somebody is doing when they're saying, yes, this is the correct word for these prompts. Now, you may notice that there's something terribly wrong in the left-hand panel. What is going on with the prefix as compared with the prefix in the complex forms? So just in case you can't read the labels, the left two bars in the left-hand panel are simplex verbs. The right two bars in that panel are complex verbs. The left bar in each pair is the v, and the right bar in each pair is s. And why is v so high? We believe that this, actually, we know that this is because, well, I guess we don't know that this is the cause. We have observed that the v in the simplex verbs is not very clearly audible. So all simplex verbs that we used, and I believe it's actually true for all simplex verbs, but I may be wrong, begin with a consonant. So v before a consonant is less clearly audible. This may be in part due to our speaker, I believe it is, and it may be in part due to the student who cut the sound file out of the long stream of sound. I believe both are true. So I believe that some of the v's were simply cut off because the person doing the cutting didn't understand what he was seeing or hearing. He was seeing it in prot and maybe hearing it. I don't know if he listened or not. But I have listened to these, I'm out of town. What kind of complex verbs? I showed you, like these, atzkobs, with a prefixal vowel and a suffixal. So the complex verbs all begin with a vowel. And so v before the vowel is always clearly audible. The thing is, I have gone back and listened to the stimuli that we used, and it is clear to me, some of the v's before consonants are clearly audible, but some of them are not. And so we believe that that is the cause of the height of the left-hand bar in the left-hand panel. If we look at complex verbs in the left-hand panel, the error rate, they're the same, so we get no information from those. So let's look at the reaction times. Again, we expect the v in simplex verbs to be the results are due to the same thing. The reaction time is due to the same thing. So let's look at the reaction time in complex verbs, and we see what we've seen before, that the reaction time is shorter. That people react more quickly to the prefixed forms. By the way, we're going to do follow-up experiments to try to correct for this V problem. And I want to look now at the no responses, but these are very hard to understand. Again, we don't understand as well what people are doing when they say no, or when they no in any experiments. In the left-hand panel, again, is the error rate. In the right, and we get nothing from that. They're all flat. They're all essential. None of these differences are, significant. And so we get no information. But if we look at the reaction time, again, the V in simplex verbs is way out of scale. But if we look at the complex verbs, there are results that we don't expect, but it's very small, and I don't know yet whether this is significant. I'm sorry that we haven't completed these analyses, but we were simply drowning. We still are drowning in data because we did UDI at the same time, and we're working on both languages for trying to get this enough on Georgian to get this ready, and trying to do the UDI for a different reason. Now I'm going to skip the third experiment and go on to the summary and tentative conclusions. These are very tentative. All of this is tentative. But there is preliminary evidence that in Georgian, prefixed words incur fewer errors and are recognized more quickly than suffixed words. This is true of inflectional morphology and seems to be true, so the evidence is less strong, of derivational morphology. We encountered two big problems. I didn't go over the second one because it's in the experiment that I didn't go over. But we talked about the first one. V seems to be harder to perceive before consonants. And I thought I was doing a great thing when I used simplex verbs, and it turns out not to have been a great thing. I should have done the lexical decision, or it might have been more accurate if I'd done the lexical decision on complex verbs, and we'll repeat that with complex verbs. The other one I won't go through since we didn't talk about that. And we plan to do follow-up experiments that, I guess is what I meant, clarify these issues and more. So we want to clarify those two issues, and we have a third point, namely that it occurred to me later to use derivation, to just not worry so much about trying to use both verbs and nouns, and use derivational morphology in verbs. So we're going to try using an I prefix and eba. I mean, I prefix as derivation requires eba, so okay. And compare that with the suffix de, which also requires eba, luckily. A bit of luck in the language. And so we can compare I and de, both of them derivational, and see whether the prefix or the suffix, well, see how they come out. So we plan more experiments to follow up on these. I'm hoping to do them in November or December. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm sorry, I didn't leave more time.
Just relate the findings to the initial question, which was, is it true that the initial portion of the word is most influential in word recognition? Because I was trying to relate them, and I was thinking, well, maybe this is showing us that it is actually still true that the initial portion of the word is most influential. but not the stem necessarily, but the word.
So spoken word recognition relies most heavily on the beginnings of words. So as I said when I presented it, the most reliable evidence is the positive evidence. The negative is harder to interpret because we understand positive answers. I'm talking about psycholinguists. I'm not really, I shouldn't use we, they understand positive answers better because they understand better what subjects, participants are doing when they press a yes key than they do when the participant presses a no key. Spoken word recognition relies most heavily on the beginnings of words, and yet, I mean, that's what they say, and yet prefixed words in Georgian, now I'm going to make a big generalization that omits some of the data, but still we have the generalization that the prefixed words were recognized faster and more accurately.
So, sorry, just to follow.
I think Masha wants to answer it also.
Maybe that's okay. I just wondered, so it makes it advantageous to have no prefix. That clearly doesn't, your experiment doesn't support that conclusion.
That's right.
And that's the main point.
That's the main point. But I think, I mean, I want to take everybody's questions, but I think Masha wanted to respond to the question. Or no, maybe you didn't.
I had a question for you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks so much for your talk and amazing amount of data. Two questions. One has to do with what counts as prefix and what counts, let's say, as acclitic. So when we're looking at verbs, we can argue that maybe those elements that we count as prefixes are actually acclitics. Would that affect your analysis?
I would say you cannot argue that. You can claim that, and it has been claimed. People have put the name clitic on it, but in fact, nobody has shown that any of the prefixes that I've been talking about have any characteristic of what has objectively been called acclitic. Nobody has ever argued that, as far as I'm aware. There are people who have said that V is acclitic, but it has none of the characteristics.
Okay, so let's assume that this is right. More generally, then we want to ask whether or not we're going to make different predictions for, excuse me, proclitics as opposed to prefixes.
Okay, this is what we did in UDI. We looked at this, and I'm not going to talk about the UDI outcome because we've gotten even less far in our analysis of UDI. But there has been analysis of only one other language, clitics in only one other language, Bulgarian. I'm just trying to remember what it found. I believe it found that proclitics in Bulgarian are easier to understand than enclitics. Do you know that? Are you nodding? Yes,
no,
you're
I'm just
agreeing?
nodding that kind of goes with intuition.
I think I remember that correctly.
Well, that kind of relates to my second question, and that is, let's say I see an element, and each element has a certain amount of entropy. So if I see an English word starting with J, it's going to be very rare. If I see an English word starting with T, it's going to be very common. So I'm not making any predictions if I hear T, but if I hear J, I'm going to make a certain predictions. And if I hear Nga in the beginning, I'm going to make a prediction. It's not going to be an English word. So that means each segment gives me certain predictive power. So I assume in your stats, you probably controlled for that. But
oh, yes, absolutely.
And
so every nonce word, every made-up word, began with a consonant or a consonant cluster that exists in another real verb in Georgian. Every single one begins with a consonant or consonant cluster that exists in real words in Georgian, and that was really important.
Va is going to start a real word, but with va, I can make a certain prediction that's probably going to be a verb after that. If I hear ma, I can make a prediction it's going to be a verb.
Okay, maybe I didn't make it clear. The nonce words.
No.
But you have to. But to make a to make a prediction, you have to have nonce words and real words. There were half of the nonce words began with the. Half of the real words began with the. I don't mean half of the words. Half of the test items in this section. So there were nouns in there also. But among the verbs that were testing this issue, half began with the, half began with some other consonant because they ended with s.
I think, sorry, just develop, Marias. Thank you for this.
Question? No.
Thank you for this question, because I also wanted, just develop here, sorry. I just wanted to mention, of course, canonical word in Georgian does not begin, cluster does not begin with w. So when the informant hears we, definitely he thinks that it must be some morphological element, because you know quite well complexes at the beginning w is excluded. This could be
I'm sorry, what is
I mean cluster complexes, not because before the vowel, and result in complex verbs is different. That's why they realize that w is not the word. Okay, do you understand what I mean?
I don't.
So when
I don't.
Alicia, when you give the example of zel, intuitively Georgian speakers know that there is no word with complex which begins in v. So the first idea is that v is prefix, very quickly. So if you go bam bop, of course they realize that it could be either word or prefix, and the result is different for complex verbs. Yeah? So
the result is different. There's no question about that.
So but I think maybe, so what I mean that canonical form of the word gives, of course, Georgian speakers does not know, but they have this unconsciousness, understanding how Georgian words begin.
Of course
they give them argument that w at the beginning before consonant could be prefix. And forces.
And it shows them that it's a verb, but it doesn't show them that it's a Georgian word, and that's the question they're asked. So what about v'b'chlim, a non-Georgian word? It still begins with the.
And they must think that this v must be prefix.
So what? The question is not, do you hear a prefix or not? The question that they're looking at is this a word of Georgian?
No. I mean when there is a real word, v'zel.
Yes, but they don't know whether what they're going to hear is a real word or a nonce word. Maybe I'm just not understanding you.
Okay, there is no matter. They think about a real word or not a real word.
That's what they're thinking about.
I mean about structure. In real words, v at the beginning is the signal that it must be prefix before consonant.
They're not asked, is this a prefix or not? That's not the question that they're asked.
But it makes them easier, quickly answer. Okay.
I don't understand. Maybe somebody else can explain the point to me.
Sorry, can I?
Sorry.
Okay, one person at a time, maybe.
There's a question back there, I think.
No, I was.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Stephen. I didn't realize you
had
a microphone.
He's
very quickly, in the context of your whole project, have you looked at Arabic?
No.
And the reason I ask that is that Arabic has an extremely reduced set of prefixes, which are extremely frequent, so much so that they can't even have, they can't use initials or acronyms, because 70–80% would begin with initial vowel, initial M, or initial T, and that's it. So you might want to get someone to look at that.
But what we need is matched prefixes and suffixes. Matched. Otherwise, you can't test it.
Okay.
I mean, that's why we chose v and s, or that's why we chose Georgian, actually, because it has matched a matched prefix and suffix. And we couldn't, I mean, we wouldn't have used,
well, you have,
I mean, we would have if we had to, but we wouldn't have wanted to use v and n, like eren.
You have them with inflectional morphology. You have corresponding prefixes and suffixes,
Right. And we don't have exactly what we need in derivational morphology.
Okay.
Thank you very much for an interesting presentation. I just would like to give you two brief questions. First is, will your research bring some input for computational linguistics as for word recognition systems or prediction? And does it deal with linearity? And also, I would like to ask you whether you distinguish during your experiment derivational and non-derivational affixes. I mean, in terms of recognition, if they give some different results.
Yes, I didn't understand your first question, but the second one is very easy. Let me answer that and then come back. So here are the results from the inflectional. Here are the results from the derivational.
And here you have timeline 1300, yeah, and then 1400. What do you mean this? These figures are seconds? Or?
Milliseconds.
Milliseconds. Okay, thank you. And the first question was whether the research will bring the input for computational linguistics in sense of word recognition.
I don't know. I just...
Does it have any pragmatic continuation?
Not that I know of.
Okay, good luck.
Does that mean I don't think you can publish this since it has no pragmatic continuation? Thank you.
Please, Daniel.
Thanks. So just following up on Steve's question, I think it's not Arabic, it's Hebrew that you want to look at if you're looking for a second language. It's got prefixes, suffixes, circumfixes. It's got them derivationally and inflectionally, both for nouns and for verbs. And speaking to Masha's question, I think you can make a clitic versus non-clitic distinction, at least for the prefixes. Maybe
in Hebrew, you mean?
Yeah. So I was making notes throughout your.
Actually, I've found a couple of languages. I mean, they're really hard to get to. That have the same element as prefixal and suffixal, and so that might be the. But I'm going to retire and not do any more of this.
And then question-wise,
you do it.
Okay. Well, we can share it if you like. But can I just look at the very first slide that you put up of the bar graphs? So, a third of people are getting word recognition of verbs wrong. Is that what the left-hand box shows?
Yes.
Isn't that amazing?
It's coming very fast. It's just very fast.
Okay. Is that like comparable in other studies? Or is Georgian just too hard to recognize?
I will tell you what some people said to me. A few of the participants told me I had used Old Georgian words. They were not Old Georgian words. I had checked every word with a speaker who told me that they were in current use and should be recognizable by a first-year university student. But she may have been wrong. I mean, she obviously was wrong because these participants, a few of them, thought that they were Old Georgian. So, and I don't know what they did with that. I don't know whether they said yes or no. Okay. Or maybe they did both. But that doesn't bother me. Maybe somebody else can speak to, because I'm not a psycholinguist, can speak to the question of whether that's unusual, but it doesn't, I don't find it concerning that they found it a difficult task. Of course, any Georgian speaker could have recognized these with a few exceptions of words that are just outside there. I was trying to find monomorphemic verbs, which it turned out I shouldn't have been trying to do, but I was in trying to do that, there just aren't that many of them, and so I did use some words that not everybody, it turns out, knows. But I don't think that accounts for most of this.
Do we still have time for questions or? Okay, one more.
Thanks. Just a quick question. Did you, maybe, Ms., did you compare error rate between just a bare word and word with a prefix or word with a suffix? So no morphology.
So like the difference between vtser and tser.
Right.
We had some in there as fillers,
right,
but we did not in fact compare them.
Because that would be interesting to see as well, because then you could actually, because S and V are much, if you look at the V and S in spectrum, you'll see, S is much more perceptible, right? But that might work in your favor, because depending on how, what happens with bare stem versus some suffix there. So that's just a thought for future, maybe.
Okay, maybe you.
So
maybe
is
you
it are error rates lower or higher if you just have tem, or if you have vtem, right? And what can that tell you about the function of v, or what are speaker doing when they're here v, and then if it's easier to perceive, well, it's a little complicated, but depending on those results, you can then maybe, control for the fact that v is less perceptible than s. So
we had initially intended to do this, but mainly it was my collaborator who decided that we didn't really need those second-person singular forms.
Okay.
So I don't know. I'll talk with him again about it. I think it could still be done.
Right.
Because I think we've got the data we need.
Right. You have. Yeah. Okay.
Okay. No, we're out of time. Sorry.
I'm sure a lot of questions must be, because the talk was really very, very interesting.
Thank you.
And very, very many issues come to mind to that end. Thank you.
Thank you
very much. And now,
let me just add that I look forward to hearing from you in coffee break time or something, the things that I didn't understand, and I'm sorry that I didn't understand some things, like Rusiko's point.
Okay. And now, please, Irina Lobzhanidze with... you need some time, okay? No, let's take. So before she prepares her presentation, my language could be processing for computer aids and goals and so on. Yeah.
Yes,
thank you for this talk in advance, because I'm sure that it will be interesting for others. And this will be the last talk. And after the talk, the bus will be waiting us for the excursion. So everybody could join.
Thank you very much. I'm really happy of being here. And I would like to thank the organizing committee, especially Tamara Kalkhitashvili and Maka Tetradze, for the great job that they have done during the organization. So my topic is about the finite state morphology and morphological analysis of Georgian language. And generally, I am somehow in the middle between the traditional approach to the linguistics and a new one approach, especially computational processing of language data. Knowledge about the morphology of a language is one of the most important components of the majority of the natural language processing systems, as you know. Computational morphology also combines computational approach with the above mentioned knowledge in order to create robust and efficient computer systems. The majority of the natural so my presentation will be held in the following order. First of all, I will talk about the finite state morphology and morphological analysis of Georgian language, methods, finding and hypotheses, and future development and conclusions, of course. The majority of the natural language systems processing systems are based from one point of view on Turing abstract model of computation, which describes a computing device in terms of a control unit containing rules, which processes symbols taken from a finite list, so-called alphabet, and from another on well-known Chomsky-Schutzenberger hierarchy, which describes a containment hierarchy of formal grammars according to the class of language it generates, the type of automata that recognizes it, and the form of its rules. So, as you see, the machine described by Turing processes its action until the sequence of input symbols is finished and it reaches a final state, accepting or rejecting it. The accepted sequence of symbols is a word, and the set of such words builds up the language of a machine. But for us, the most important is the third type described by the Chomsky's hierarchy. It's the third type of grammar, so-called regular grammars, and the correspondingly finite state automata, FCA, also known as a finite state machine. Unlike the Turing machine, a finite state automata can move in one direction only, left to right, and can return the input looking at each symbol in turn. The automaton, which is always in one of a finite set of states, moves to a new state based on the symbol just read and its current internal state. A FCI can model systems that at all times must be in one of a finite number of states, and the regular language accepted by a FCI can always be encoded as a regular expression. More formally, a finite automaton can be defined by the following 5 parameters. First of all, a finite set of states, a finite input alphabets of symbols, a transition matrix between 2 arguments, the start state, and of course the set of final states. A language accepted by FCA can be always encoded by as a regular expression. For example, we can consider a transition network for Georgian language in a form of a finite state automata using the following 5-tube definition stated above. The sequence of symbols in the example network that leads to a final or accepting state are man and mas. This valid sequence of symbols are called words. The language of this automaton is the set of words it accepts. Language man, mas. The FCA can therefore be seen as a language acceptor and at the same time as a language generator. Starting in the start state, the FCA will output the label of each transition it takes from the start state to a final state. An important constraint on a language is that the alphabet is finite. Therefore, although a language can have an infinite number of strings, the strings must be drawn from a fixed and finite alphabet. A language accepted by FCA can always be encoded as a regular expression, and the regular expression of the language man-mas is man and mas, meaning M followed by A, followed by either N or S. Languages accepted by the finite state automata are regular languages. Regular languages belong to a category of languages that are characterized by the fact that the symbol at a particular location in a string is dependent only on a bound amount of information about the preceding symbols. A regular language is described using regular expressions. Therefore, regular expressions can be used to define finite state automata. A variation of the finite state automata is the finite state transducer, also known as a Meili machine. The advantage of the finite state automata over the finite state transducers over the finite state automata is that in addition to accepting or rejecting the input string as being part of the language, it can translate an input string into an output string and thereby output useful information regarding the input. FCA defines a formal language by defining a set of strings, but a transducer defines a relation between languages by definition relation between sets of strings. The final state transducer is the encoding of a mapping regular relation between 2 languages, lexical upper language and a surface lower language. It can work not only as a language acceptor but also as a language generator. If a string from the lexical language is input, the corresponding surface string is output generated and vice versa. A transducer is a device which can take one type of input and produce a different type of output. Therefore, these transducers transducers which can accept a lexical string and output a surface string makes it a lexical transducer. The fact that it can work in either directions means that the lexical transducer is inherently bidirectional. So the use of transducers for the description of a language is closely connected to the following question. One of the most important questions, which kind of patterns are worthy to be described, regular or irregular ones? It's well known that regular and irregular inflectional types or morphologies differ from one another by the forms. Regular forms are generally defined as those that undergo predictable transformations, including affixation, while irregulars undergo at least partly idiosyncratic transformations, including stem changes. Traditionally, languages of the world are classified as analytic, characterized by a small number of affixes with grammatical relationship encoded by word order and auxiliary words, and into synthetic languages subdivided into fusional and agglutinative. Fusional languages are characterized by affixes representing several functions and denoting multiple grammatical, syntactic, and semantic features, while in agglutinative languages, words can be composed of different affixes with unique grammatical or semantic function. Agglutinative languages have generally one grammatical category per affix, while fusional languages have multiple. As you know, Georgian is somehow of a mixed type of languages. Thus, a finite state technology, as described by Beasley, for example, is generally used for morphological analysis of languages like Georgian. Methods. Modern Georgian, as I have said, belongs to morphologically rich languages. It means that the morphologically rich nature of Georgian expresses different levels of information at the word level, and the grammatical functions of words are not associated with their syntactic positions. This leads to a high degree of word order variation, especially at the level of sentence. At the same time, there are a lot of natural language processing systems used for treating languages with concatenative morphology, like Georgian. One of the most famous approach to the morphological analysis of such kind is a finite state technology. Finite state technology is used in morphological processing, semantics, and also during the last period in discourse modeling. As you know, different research groups specialized in computational linguistics in Georgia, modeling, computational modeling of Georgian language, used different kind of systems for the computational processing of Georgian language. There are some groups working in this direction, but their approach to the modeling of Georgian verbal patterns, their decisions, they are different. Some of their models are worth of describing apparently. For example, Datukishvili, Luladze, Zekalashvili described combination of different morphs, their use in templatic patterns, and application of the above-mentioned patterns to the computational modeling system, so-called morphological processor. Margolani, analyzing word forms and their application to spell checking of modern Georgian language, paid special attention to complicated patterns caused by multi-harmonic affixes used for different parts of speech. The system, as realized, consisted of roots and algorithm, which constructed from affixes and roots correct form. Approach described above generally follow the description of Georgian verbal pattern paradigm as stated by Shanidze. Gurevich and Kapanadze in their work were first who used finite state transducers and followed with linguistic approach of previous authors. Kapanadze subdivided Georgian verbal pattern in 5 groups, especially transitive, intransitive, medial, inversion, and stative, while Gurevich, stating the lexical states of Melikishvili, urges that her classification is too fine, chooses the system described previously, but tries to find interdependencies between future and conditional, or aorist and perfect. During the compilation of a full-scale computational grammar within the framework of the lexical functional grammar, Moerer has used similar finite state calculus as well, but in contrast to the above-mentioned approach, his work is based on a digitized version of Chenkeli dictionary with verbal nouns and especially verbal roots considered as initial lemmas for verbs. None of the previous computerized approach to Georgian verbal paradigm follows the theory of Melikishvili, in spite of the fact that it classifies Georgian verbs by diathesis, the inflected form of a Georgian verb, and the phrasal components expressed by its morphology, indicating how they relate to one another morphosyntactically. The verb and argument as its performer, undergoer, beneficiary, etc. First, taking into account the above-mentioned approach, the linguistic distribution of Georgian language is based on 4 main aspects. I'm sorry, this slide on methods generally used, but I have talked about it. Taking into account the above-mentioned approach, the linguistic description of Georgian language is based on 4 main aspects: quantity of morpheme slots to be described, internal changes between or within morphemes and slots, linguistic theory used for reference, and of course lemma and type of dictionaries used. The morphological analyzer of modern Georgian language is developed as bidirectional finite state transducer by means of Xerxes finite state tools, which is sufficient for capturing morphological structure of modern Georgian. The system includes 13 blocks of the existing part of speech of modern Georgian, as well as separate blocks for punctuation and abbreviations, while the patterns of verbal paradigms are subdivided into additional 66 groups, as described by Melekishvili, and an additional group of irregular verbs. At this moment, the lexicon consists of nouns subdivided into proper and common ones, verbs, and other entries. Each lemma for nouns generates approximately to 3,000 units per paradigm, while for verbs, 53,000 approximately per subject and object paradigms. We have different paradigms, as you know. The system overview, the morphotactics of language is encoded in lexicons. It's on the right part. And of course, alternation rules are encoded in the form of appropriate regular expressions. The parts of speech which undergo alternation rules are verbs, verb, noun, adjective, pronoun, and numeral. But as we have seen that the verbal pattern is slightly different because we are included 66 groups, as I have stated above. The lexicon data are processed in accordance with the appropriate alternation rules. It allows us to distinguish the appropriate lemma and morphological categories. The other issue which is worth of describing are morphosyntactic features and their representation in the taxet. It should be mentioned that the variety of taxet always depends on the end user. From one point of view, there should be made a parallel with the existing taxets, but from the other, there should be taken into account the features and functions of linguistic theory under consideration. During the last time, some computational approach described so-called theory-neutral taxets and their priorities. Of course, it's very important for the future syntactic connections between in the form of universal dependencies between languages, but it's really impossible, not possible to have a theory-neutral annotation. Every tagging scheme makes some theoretical assumptions. So choosing the possible taxet, there should be taken into account some taxets of European language available online, like parole, multitext, and other, but the main attention should be paid to the grammatical feature they describe and the possibility of their use in case of modern Georgian. The last attempt, as I know, to compile a taxet of modern Georgian language and accordingly to represent them in a form as future libraries, one of which approach was made by Daraseli and Sharaf, as I know. Here you can see taxet which can be considered as really a huge one, especially from the viewpoint of verbal features. It possesses information completely on all morphological categories of Georgian verb, and also it includes information on the case and thematic roles of subject and object, but especially the other process which is also very important for Georgian is so-called lemmatization problem. I want to mention lemmatization process because which is closely connected to the advanced search option as implemented, for example, in the Dictionary of Idioms. As you know, lemmatization is the process of deriving the base form or lemma of a word from one of its inflected forms. It means that we have to take a raw text, and any word which can be met in the raw text should be analyzed and should include information on its initial form. For languages with rich morphology, like Georgian language, lemmatization may be considered as quite a difficult task, taking in mind that it requires a lexicon consisting of lemmata with a set of rules for creating inflected forms. In modern Georgian, the lemma for nominal paradigm is a form in nominative case singular, but what can be considered as a lemma for Georgian verbal paradigm? This question is generally described in different in literature, and one of the standards that you can see, it's math, and it says lemma is a lemmatized form class of inflected forms differing only by inflectional morphology. A lemma is usually referred to by one of these forms arbitrarily chosen. And so we have generally two options in Georgian dictionaries for the definition of the initial keyword for the definition of lemma. One from the morphological point of view is verbal noun, so-called masdar. The second one is present indicative, especially its form in the third subject singular. Both of these approaches can be described separately, but taking into account that the focus of our presentation is closely connected to the existing of word indexes and their use for the processing of the Georgian verbal structure. We have chosen the second approach as presented by Nolchikobaba and Melikishvili because these dictionaries really include a huge indexes of Georgian verbs. Also, there should be mentioned that if we consider a possibility of stemming, for stemming purposes, the second person singular in present indicative may be considered as a unit closely associated with a stem, and it can be considered as a better choice. As it was mentioned above, the computational model of a language is always associated with the possibility to use dictionaries for the compilation of lexicon, because all of the systems include lexicons and include alternation rules. So we have problem with in our printed dictionaries. Absence of an infinite form of a verb affects dictionary entries and causes use of different patterns. Some dictionaries include entries represented in the form of verbal nouns, so-called masdars, others in the form of verbs in the third person singular of present tense, or sometimes in the third person single or present or future indicative, which is completely impossible. Also, there are dictionaries processing both of the above mentioned forms, and some of them are representing in the form of an abstract verbal root with appropriate paradigms, as Chenkeli. Chenkeli's dictionary is, of course, linguistic one and can't be used by a native or non-native speaker of Georgian to get information about the semantic information about the word. So, Georgian, but why all our dictionaries, printed dictionaries, have this problem? We have to, this problem is associated with the representing of verbal forms in dictionary entries caused by the absence of infinitive, first of all, polypersonalism of Georgian verb, which causes inclusion of different verbal patterns in the majority of Georgian printed or electronic dictionaries, searching patterns for verbal forms in electronic and online dictionaries, having in mind that it's completely impossible to focus on a lemma for verbal forms and to provide their setting in alphabet order. If we consider the a stem as an initial state for the dictionary entry, then we get different, we can't provide their setting in alphabet order. But why this problem really originates? This problem is always connected with the quantity of slots in Georgian verbal pattern. The maximum possible quantity of slots in verbal template, as you know, varies from 9 to 12, as described by Boyder, Hewitt, and others, and consists of the following units: preverbs, prefixal personal markers, version markers, stem. Our stem is on the fourth position, when it's followed by passive markers, thematic markers, causative markers, script markers, suffixal personal markers, and so on. And the problem that our stem is on the fourth position really causes the problem that I have talked at the beginning. In nominal template, it varies from 4 to 8, and nominal template, as you see, the position of stem is the stem is on the first position. The other problem that we have in our during the in addition, any kind of morpheme gives information about the grammatical function of word. Georgian verb generally uses bound morphemes to show its grammatical function. The main ways of use are as follows: affixation, root vowel alternation, root alternation. For example, if we have a verb itsantsalebda, how it can be put in the dictionary to be very easily accessed to non-native speaker of Georgian. If we put tzantsalebs, a non-native speaker should know that itsantsalebda, the beginning of the lemma form of itsantsalebda is tzantsalebs. For example, if we'll consider the second example, modrika, how, for example, a non-native speaker can understand that the lemma for verb modrika is drex. Or, for example, we have root alternations, and how non-native speaker will not be able to find, for example, in the dictionary, a verbal form eubneba, and to understand that it's connected with its surface level verb word etris. So, a similar problem can be met in online dictionaries as well. Really, the problem that I have talked before, it forces native and non-native speakers of Georgian to acquire grammatical information on Georgian verbal patterns with purpose of searching and translating, which really have a negative impact on language acquisition. So, the similar problem we can see in online dictionaries of idioms, different types of access to the data generally by special filters, which allow user to look for a word not only in the head word list, but also in the whole databases. For instance, let's see Chikobava's dictionary available online. Thank you to Manjgaladze and Ratis Hetladze. They have put this resource online, and it's really useful resource. But this dictionary allows us to implement two kinds of searches, especially by keyword and by word represented in the database itself. This possibility is rather difficult to acquire, taking into account that if the end user generally has a possibility to find some words in the database, it can't acquire the knowledge of the meaning of these words and can't use them for her purposes. So, now I will focus on the analyzer itself. As I have said, the compiled an analyzer for modern Georgian language, and now I want to, during the compilation of systems of course testing and error analysis, they are based on the following: rule integrity. The LEX tools offers the lookup and look down commands with Xefasta tools, apply up and apply down as described in Beasley. At the same time, the system gets big, and the finite state calculus has an option of regression test. So we have provided regression testing comparing two versions to find lost surface words and to find then edit words. The system was run and fixed periodically. The second test was well-formedness of surface representation of paradigms. The tags appear in accordance with the order defined preliminary to provide where possible integration into the other systems. And language coverage testing is one of the most important tests during the error analysis. The language coverage, as you know, it's always associated with the Zipfian distributions. In terms of frequency, always depends on the distribution. Such kind of distributions mean that in all languages of the world, not only in Georgian, a small quantity of words has a high frequency of use, an average quantity an intermediate frequency, and a large quantity of words are very low, are words of very low frequency, which varies from 1 to 2. The morphological analyzer has been tested on the Georgian language corpus, consisting of approximately 7 million words and available at Corpore Ilia Unia Duje. We have provided and online access to this corpus, and it's possible to see and to look for words in, for example, this is this resource, and there is a possibility to find for words not only by its typing, but also on the basis of the linguistic information about these words, including part of speech, types of words, singular or plural cases, degrees, diatheses, and etc. And etc. So generally, we have tested our analyzer on the basis of this resource, and now I want to show you the last test that we have implemented approximately 7 months ago. It's testing, we have chosen from the corpus 10,000 words, more frequently used words. And of course, we tested in this case the language coverage from one point of view, and from the second point of view, words recognized by transducer to know how it really works. Generally, such kind of tests don't need a lot of data. Generally, when we looked through the similar tests implemented for other languages, they generally took about 500 words, and it's sufficient to understand is a system robust or it is not working. But we have decided to take as much words as it possible. So the first test was made on 1,000. The second test was made on 2,000. The third test was made on 5,000, and the fourth test was made on 10,000 words. So the results are as follows, and when we have decided to provide similar tests only for verbal paradigms, and in this case we have taken 10,000 words. The quantity of verbs per 10,000 words was equal to 550, including 521 recognized by, as you said, 9 not recognized. It means the recognition rate for verbs between these 1,000 more frequently used words of Georgian is about 98%. But as you see here, the percentage is lower, is about 92% when we talk about the not so frequent words. At this stage, the words are more frequent, then of course the frequency of words decreases. But of course we have to talk about the errata which they are met in the system with regards to verbal patterns. Why? Because noun patterns are very simple, but verbal patterns from some case of view are different and are and have problems. So we have overlapping between the classes of the first diathesis, 19 and 26. We have overlapping between the classes of the second diathesis. Then the similar verb is generated in different classes. Of course, it gives us additional morphological ambiguity. We have overlapping between the classes of different diatheses, and we have lemmatization problem with regarding to the class of the third diathesis, because the classes of the third diathesis, as described by Damana Melikishvili, are generally syntactic ones, and these verbs are generally generated and by our classes as well. So we think that at last this problem can be solved by removal of some classes from the analyzer. Ambiguity with regards to polypersonalism, but I think that all who worked on the computational modeling of Georgian language met this problem. They mean the verbs, I talk about verbs which can be at the same time 3 personal verbs and 2 personal verbs, which can be 2 personal verbs and 1 personal verbs, depending on the context. They have problems with historical forms, dialect forms and variations, and named entities. One moment. The compilation, the other problem, what we have done after that, after the development of the morphological analyzer and after all these tests, we have decided to have a real practical use of the morphological analyzer. For this purpose, we have tried another possibility. Generally, we have compiled an online dictionary of idioms. If you know, idioms are expressions. They are not a word taken separately. And we determined the form of the online dictionary and the structure of entries, revised the existing units using Kakandas from the corpus of modern Georgian available and additional one created in telex system. We have used telex system for the compilation of dictionary. The dictionary is monolingual and bilingual. Bilingual, it's in Georgian and modern Greek, and vice versa in modern Greek, Georgian. It's It's available on the idiom Siliaunia Duje, and we launched this system. Georgian is the dictionary is monolingual, as I have said, and bidirectional bilingual. But I want to pay special attention to the type of search, because we have, of course, quick search, as it's generally used in the majority of the dictionaries of the world. We have alphabetic search, as it's also generally used in the majority dictionaries of the world. We have wildcard, which can assist and help a non-native speaker to find a word by using this wildcard, but we have added advanced search based on the morphological analyzer of Georgian, which this option performs search. This option performs search for any kind of word as it's met in the raw text and gives users the possibility to see direct translation of its initial form. In our case, it's the third person singular for verbs and nominative case singular for nouns. For example, let's consider idiom sitsotskhlekonia. As you know, it's not a frozen unit. Georgian idioms differ from one point of view from the well-known frozenness hierarchy because they undergo different change, especially in case of verbs. So, for example, let's take sitsotskhlekonia. It's you are lucky, you are happy. It can be used sitsotskhlekonia, sitsotskhlemkonia, etc. Verbal forms mkonia, konia are connected to ax, has, or kona, possession. It does not matter which of the traditions we follow. The system available online determines the lemma sign for a verb, konia, by means of a morphological analyzer as follows. And when the morphological analyzer returns to the system the initial lemma of a word, in our case the lemma ax, has, and the system provides search in the database and returns all verbal MVS associated with the above mentioned form. Let me show it online. For example, advanced search. For example, Mkonda. And it returns all the verbs. Mkonda, as you know, it's the past of the verb ax or kona. And amba vimoax, barits helsiax, burtigax, all these forms are idioms, and we can find the appropriate idiom by means of the word which can be met in a raw text. So I want to talk now about the future development, what we are working at this moment. First of all, we have started to develop a morphological analyzer for all Georgian, but we have not started to develop a morphological analyzer of Old and Middle or Georgian from the scratch because we have some background in this field. We have started to adapt the morphological analyzer of modern Georgian for the morphological analysis of Old and Middle, but we have some kind of problems which should be decided, and we work on it. First of all, the representation of scripts, writing systems, because as you know, Georgian manuscripts include not only Asumtavruli text, not only Mkhedruli text as it's met in our modern Georgian, but Asumtavruli and Dushuri as well. We have to show special characters like 5 letters which disappeared, discarded from Georgian alphabet in 1879, as you know, and non-syllabic U. We have tokenization problem of Georgian manuscripts, which are not segmented according to the white space between words, or are partially segmented according to white space, a special marker like 3 dots. At the same time, punctuation markers are not represented in the majority of Georgian manuscripts and can't be used for the tokenization. We have some kind of problem with titlo diacritic, and the potential ambiguity at the morphological level and structural differences, of course, between Old, Middle, and Modern Georgian. The other project that we are working at is Georgian English Online Dictionary based on Rayfield Comprehensive Georgian English Dictionary with advanced search as it's represented in the Online Dictionary of Idioms. We have asked Donald Rayfield to give us a possibility to use his great work, and he agreed. We have, and the future, of course, is development of morphological glossars for the entries not represented in the lexicon, which will define phonologically possible forms, morphosyntactic disambiguation by means of constraint grammar, and of course, at last, dependency analysis. But at this moment, we are working on the Old Georgian and on the Georgian English online dictionary. Thank you very much. Thank you for your attention.
When I Google, like when I'm trying to do field work via the internet, and I'm just Googling Georgian verbs, I very often get related conjugations, which suggest that there's some, either the system that underlies the search engine has figured out that certain verb forms are related, or else somebody's already done some parsing work and has fed that into the search engine. Do you know what exactly is going on there?
It depends on which search engine you have. Google.
Yeah.
Google has different kind of approach. Google approaches are generally statistical based ones. Our approach is generally rule based ones. And that's why I think there was this much, because what you were expected to find and what you get.
So will your work eventually possibly feed into a better search engine for linguists? Okay, wishful thinking.
Thank you very much both for the talk and also for the work you're doing, because this is immensely useful and we can all benefit from that. So my question is how these corpora that you've shown us intersect or not intersect with some other corpora of Georgian that exist online. Because it seems like yours is the most extensive, but there are some other ones. I've seen one which is very similar to the Russian national corpus. It even has the same colors. And I've seen another one which I think was done in Germany somewhere. So I wanted to ask you what the articulation is across those corpora.
To tell you, according to my opinion, Georgian language is represented online, and it's a great opportunity for all users to find what they are looking for. Generally, we meet at the conferences, and I am really happy that so many people works in this direction. I can't say that we have linking data between each other. It would be a great benefit, I think, for all of us to provide links between our jobs, but at this moment it's not done. So.
And the other corpora are also root-based like yours, or are they differently organized?
Different corpora. Some corpora are tagged. Some corpora are not tagged. Some corpora provides linguistic search. Some corpora don't provide linguistic search. So it depends on the user, which is more useful for his or her purposes, I think.
Thank you, Maria, again for the question, because this is really problem for Georgian community. Everybody does different kind of corporas, and of course the best is when everything is together.
Not only for
but it's
Georgian community.
really very difficult. Georgians are individuals. Everybody likes to be. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm also very excited by what a resource this could be for many people. Like the one thing that comes to mind, and I'm wondering whether you already have the capacity for it. Do you have the ability of functioning as a affix-based dictionary where you can see, like, get a list of all of the stems that combine with specific affixes, so do an affix-based search as opposed to
It depends on which kind of affixes you want to take. For example, we can generate inflectional ones, but we can't generate all derivational affixes that are used in Georgian language, because derivational are not markers in the point of view of linguistic, of the possibility of their linguistic annotation. They are important for semantic development and semantic generation of new words, but we have not provided tags for derivational ones.
But can you input an affix and it will have it return a list of forms that use that affix?
Turn list of forms which use the suffix. We can generate affixes according to the part of speech, which they are used with.
To the part of speech, so like a template.
Speech, only like a template.
Okay.
For example, verbs needs this affixes, noun needs other kind of affixes.
Yeah.
Some affixes may be overlapping each other. For example, say S, third singular, and at the same time the dative case can be marked by S. But we can do this only on the templatic, as a templatic form.
I see. Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions? Or okay.
Thank you.
No, thank you, everybody. Thank you, our speaker.